Hey guys, tonight we're going to settle in and talk about a place that feels as timeless as storytelling itself. The pub, the tavern, the local watering hole. I want you to picture it for a moment. A low-beamed ceiling, the air thick with the smell of old wood, spilled ale, and damp wool. There's a soft, flickering light from a tallow candle, casting long, dancing shadows on the wattle and daub walls. The low murmur of hushed conversations, punctuated by the gentle, reassuring clink of a clay mug being set down on a worn wooden table. This scene has played out, in one form or another, for thousands of years. But while these spaces seem built for comfort and escape, they have a second, hidden history. One of secrets and plots, of revolution and control. Of course, you probably wouldn't have survived your first visit to one of its ancient ancestors. The house wine was likely more vinegar than water. The beer was a chunky, yeasty soup that was probably safer, but not necessarily tastier, than the local water supply. And the only thing flowing more freely than the gossip was the rainwater dripping through the thatched roof. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in a cozy English pub, but under the relentless Mediterranean sun on the dusty, impeccably straight roads of the Roman Empire. The Romans, as we know, were ambitious builders. They constructed over ling miles of paved roads, a circulatory system for their vast empire, pumping legions, governors, merchants, and messengers from the misty shores of Britain to the deserts of Syria. This incredible feat of engineering created a constant, churning river of humanity. But this river needed eddies, places to slow down and rest. This relentless movement created a fundamental need for roadside infrastructure, places to rest, to eat, and to water one's horses, or more importantly, oneself. Enter the Roman public house, which came in several distinct flavors. At the most basic level was the taberna, a word that simply means shop or a stall in Latin, often little more than a single room opening onto the street. These were tucked into the ground floor of bustling apartment blocks. Known as insulae, they were the ancient equivalent of a corner convenience store, selling bread, cheese, olives, and of course, wine. For hot food and a more convivial atmosphere, one might visit a pepina. These were simple eateries, serving prepared meals like lentil stew, salted fish, and sausages, all washed down with cheap wine. They were, by all accounts, crowded, noisy, and often smoky from the cooking hearths. Finally, for the traveler who needed to stay the night, there was the capona, the true inn. These larger establishments offered stabling for animals, private rooms of varying quality, and food and drink. They were vital arteries of the empire, but they were not places of luxury. The Roman elite, the senators and aristocrats, viewed these establishments with immense disdain. To them, the tabernae and popinae were dens of plebs and slaves, filled with gambling, prostitution, and low-class behavior. A respectable patrician would socialize at a private dinner party, a convivium, in the comfort of his own home. To be seen frequenting a public capona would be a serious blow to one's public dignity, or dignitas. Yet this very fact, that they were the domain of the common person, made them politically significant. It was in the smoky, boisterous confines of a pina in the Subura district of Rome that a legionary, fresh from service on the German frontier, might share a bench with a merchant whose ship had just docked from Alexandria. The soldier might bring grim news of a barbarian raid that wouldn't reach the Senate for weeks, while the merchant might whisper about a new tax on grain in Egypt, that would soon make bread more expensive for everyone in the capital. This was the news feed of the non-elite. The state could post edicts on a whitewashed public board, but it was in the tavern that those edicts were debated, digested, ridiculed, and absorbed into the public consciousness. They were organic, uncontrolled nodes in a great information network, a place where the pulse of the empire could be felt not from the top down, but from the bottom up. When the Western Roman Empire eventually fractured and fell in the 5th century, its magnificent road system fell into disrepair. Travel became dangerous and rare. The world became smaller, more local, more fragmented. In the damp and misty Isles of Britain, the Roman way of life faded like a dream. The grand project of the state was replaced by the more immediate, intimate concerns of the village. The drink of choice shifted too. The grapevines the Romans had planted withered in the cooler climate, but barley, a hardy and resilient grain, thrived. Ale became the staple drink of the Anglo-Saxons. And this wasn't just a beverage, it was liquid bread. In an age before reliable sanitation, drinking water from a river or well was a gamble with diseases like dysentery and cholera. The process of brewing, however, involved boiling the water, which killed off most pathogens. The finished product was a thick, nutritious, and calorie-dense porridge-like brew. For a peasant performing hard physical labor from dawn till dusk, ale provided essential hydration and energy. It was a vital part of the daily diet for everyone from the local lord to the humblest churl. In this early medieval world, brewing wasn't a specialized trade but a domestic chore, handled almost exclusively by women. These skilled practitioners, who came to be known as alewives, would brew for their own families. An alewife who proved particularly adept and produced a surplus could sell it to her neighbors. And how did she advertise her fresh batch in a largely illiterate society? Not with a written sign, but with a wonderfully simple and effective piece of visual communication: the ale stake. When her brew was fermented and ready, the alewife would take a long pole, often with a leafy bush or a bit of greenery tied to the end for visibility, and stick it out horizontally from an upper window or the door of her cottage. This simple object, thrust out into the village lane, was the direct ancestor of the elaborate carved and painted pub signs we see today. T4. Any villager returning from the fields would see the stake and know that a fresh, fortifying drink was available. They would enter what was, for all intents and purposes, a private home and gather in the main room to share the brew. There were no barmen, no branded tankards, just a family selling their surplus for a few pennies a cup. It was here, in these impromptu domestic alehouses, that the social function of the public house was truly born. This was the village commons, its forum, and its community center, all rolled into one. It was where a marriage might be brokered, a lost sheep accounted for, and the latest grievance against the local reeve aired in sympathetic company. Of course, wherever commerce and community gather, regulation eventually follows. Early on, this would have been highly informal, village elders perhaps decreeing that an alewife who watered down her brew would be shamed. But by the 16th century, with the Norman kings firmly in control of England, a more formalized system emerged with the passing of the famous assize of bread and ale in Aachen-Arbach-Loop. On the surface, this was a landmark piece of consumer protection legislation. It linked the price of a gallon of ale to the price of grain, aiming to prevent price gouging and ensure a standard quality and measure for the public. However, historians still argue whether the primary motivation was truly the welfare of the common drinker. Was it about protecting the peasant from a thin, overpriced pint? Or was it more about the dawning realization by a centralizing state that these thousands of alehouses represented a massive, untapped source of revenue and control? By regulating them, the crown could begin to impose levies, grant official licenses, and standardize the trade under its own authority. This was a quiet but profound transformation. The alehouse, born organically from the domestic kitchen and the alewife's skill, was now officially on the government's books. It had traveled a long road from the Roman rest, stopped to the heart of the English village, and in doing so had become far too important to be left alone. The official gaze of the state, embodied by the assize of bread and ale, was initially a distant one. In the day-to-day life of the village, enforcement fell to a figure both respected and perhaps a little feared, the ale conner. This was a man appointed by the local manor court or town council, a professional taste tester whose job title, conner, derived from the Old English cunnion, meaning to test or to know. When an alewife had a new batch ready, the conner would be summoned to pass judgment. This was a serious business. A poor brew could sicken a village, while a good one was a source of communal pride and vital sustenance. The conner would examine the ale's clarity, sniff its aroma, and of course take a deep, thoughtful draught. But there is a far more colorful, though likely apocryphal, tale of their methods. One of our story's more charming and quirky historical tidbits. This fringe theory suggests a far more practical, if slightly undignified, quality control test. According to this legend, the ale conner would arrive wearing a sturdy pair of leather breeches. He would deliberately spill some of the fresh ale onto a wooden bench and then promptly sit down in the puddle. There he would remain for a considerable time, perhaps sipping another cup, while the ale slowly soaked into his trousers and dried. The crucial moment came when he tried to stand up. If the brew was good, it would contain a healthy amount of residual sugars from a proper barley malt fermentation. As the liquid evaporated, this sticky sugar would act as a weak glue. His leather breeches would adhere firmly to the wooden bench, and he would have to peel himself off with a satisfactory rip. This stickiness was the seal of approval. If, however, the ale had been watered down or improperly brewed, it would lack sugar and he would stand up with no resistance at all. The alewife would then be fined, or in some cases, subjected to public punishment, such as being paraded through the village or put in the cucking stool. Historians mostly dismiss this as a bit of amusing folklore, but it beautifully illustrates the popular understanding of what made ale good. It was not just its intoxicating effect, but its very substance and sweetness that proved its worth. As medieval England grew more prosperous and organized, the simple alehouse began to differentiate. It was joined by the more ambitious tavern and the purpose-built inn. An alehouse remained a domestic affair, run from a cottage, serving only the homebrew and catering to the immediate neighborhood. The tavern was a feature of the town. Crucially, taverns were licensed to sell wine, an imported luxury that made them the domain of merchants, lawyers, and skilled artisans, men with a little more silver in their purses. The most prestigious taverns in London were aligned with the powerful worshipful company of vintners, the guild that controlled the wine trade. Then there was the inn, the apex predator of the hospitality world. Often built brand new, inns were substantial structures, frequently designed around a large central courtyard, accessible through an archway. The ground floor would contain the kitchens, the public rooms, and storage, while the upper floors, accessible by external galleries overlooking the yard, contained rooms for lodging. This very design had a wonderful side effect. That central courtyard, surrounded by tiered balconies, made for a perfect makeshift theatre. Before London had purpose-built playhouses like the Globe, travelling troupes of actors would set up a temporary stage in an inn yard. The common folk could stand in the yard, the pit, while wealthier patrons could pay a bit more to watch from the comfort of the galleries. This mainstream historical fact reminds us that many of Shakespeare's early plays likely premiered not to a hushed, reverent audience in a dark theatre, but amidst the chaotic, vibrant, and noisy atmosphere of a busy London inn. For centuries, however, the most reliable and often most comfortable lodging was not provided by private enterprise at all, but by the church. Monasteries, particularly those belonging to the Benedictine order, had a sacred duty to provide hospitality to travelers, especially pilgrims. They operated large guest houses, breweries that produced some of the best ale in the kingdom, and infirmaries. For a weary merchant or a royal messenger on the king's business, the local abbey was often the safest port in a storm. This all changed with the volcanic force of King Henry VIII. His desperate quest for a male heir which led to his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and the subsequent break with the Catholic Church, culminated in one of the most significant acts in English history: the dissolution of the monasteries. Between Iten-Wu-Bite Saint-Chaloup and Iten-Wu-Bite Cicéry, the crown systematically disbanded and seized the wealth of nearly Jewbite religious houses. The monks and nuns were pensioned off, the precious lead was stripped from the roofs and melted down for the royal coffers, and the vast tracts of land, perhaps a quarter of all cultivated land in England, were seized and sold off, mostly to the Tudor nobility and a rising class of wealthy commoners. The social and religious consequences were seismic, but it also triggered an unintended revolution in the tavern industry. With the monasteries and their extensive guest facilities wiped off the map practically overnight, a massive void in national infrastructure was created. Where would travelers now stay? The answer came from the very men who had profited from the dissolution. The new owners of these former church lands, savvy businessmen with a sharp eye for profit, saw the gaping hole in the market. They began investing heavily in building new secular inns and upgrading existing ones to handle the increased demand. This led to a golden age of inn construction. The archetypal English country inn, the timber-framed, gabled building with its roaring fireplaces and comforting presence that we imagine today, is largely a product of this post-dissolution boom. Responsibility for the nation's travelers had been forcibly transferred from the church to the private sector, and the state, of course, was delighted to license and tax this flourishing new industry, now firmly established as a vital part of England's economic and social machinery. The tavern began to attract a new kind of governmental scrutiny, one focused less on revenue and more on control. In an age without broadcast media, the public house was where public opinion was brewed right alongside the ale. A whisper in a backroom in York could become a roar in a London tavern a week later. Monarchs, especially those who felt their grip on the throne was less than secure, grew wary of this, and the late Tudor and early Stuart periods were rife with insecurity. This is where the state's listening apparatus began to tune into the frequency of tavern talk. The concept of an organized pub spy network is a matter of some debate among scholars. It's highly unlikely that there was a centralized office in Whitehall dispatching agents in trench coats and dark glasses to the taverns of England. The reality remains a point of, was it a formal system managed by spy masters like Sir Francis Walsingham under Elizabeth I, or a more informal, ad hoc arrangement? Most evidence points to the latter. Local magistrates would pay a few shillings to a known informant, a nosy Parker, who was a pub regular, or perhaps they would lean on the publican himself, reminding him where his loyalties should lie, to pass. The anxieties of the state were very real. The lingering threat of Catholic plots, the rise of radical Puritanism, and the general grumbling over taxes created a climate of suspicion. Queen Elizabeth I survived numerous plots against her life. Later, the infamous gunpowder plot of Chen-Lupite Ling-Wu terrified the government of King James I, proving that deadly conspiracies could be hatched in secret meetings, and where better to meet than in the anonymous, crowded room of a tavern. A careless toast to a Catholic claimant across the sea, or a bitter complaint about the king's spending, could be picked up by a listening ear and reported. The tavern's atmosphere of false privacy could be a trap. King James I, having come down from Scotland to rule a rather unruly England, was particularly paranoid about these establishments. He saw them as breeding grounds for dissent. In Chen-Lupite, his government issued a formal proclamation known as the Directions for Alehouse Keepers. Nominally, it was about maintaining public order. Publicans were forbidden to allow drunkenness, gambling, or seditious songs. They were ordered to close during hours of worship and to refuse service to masterless men. The transient, unemployed individuals who were seen as a source of instability, but the political subtext was crystal clear. It made the alehouse keeper an unwilling agent of the state. He was now legally responsible for policing the behavior, and by extension, the speech of his customers. The friendly host, whose livelihood depended on creating a welcoming space, was now also potentially the king's informant, tasked with stamping out the first embers of treason before they could catch fire. The humble alehouse had completed its transformation from a private kitchen to the very heart of its community, only to find that its heartbeat was now being monitored by a nervous and ever-watchful crown. The political anxieties of the English crown, which had turned the friendly local into a potential surveillance outpost, traveled across the Atlantic with the colonists themselves. Just as they packed their Bibles, their tools, and their hopes for a new life, they also brought with them their ingrained, unshakable need for a public house. They were, after all, Englishmen, and the idea of a town without a proper tavern was as unnatural as a church without a steeple. But as the sapling of English culture was planted in the rugged soil of the New World, it grew into something familiar yet distinct. The tavern, like the colonists themselves, began to develop a uniquely American character. Across the sprawling, sparsely populated 13 colonies, the tavern was not merely a feature of the community, it was often its nucleus. In a new settlement, hacked out of the wilderness, the tavern was frequently the first substantial public building to be constructed, sometimes even before the church. Trin's role expanded far beyond what it had been in the old country. It was the post office, where mail, carried by riders on rough post roads, would be dropped off for collection. It was the courthouse, where traveling magistrates would hold session, hearing cases from land disputes to petty theft. It was an auction house, a marketplace for deals, a recruitment center for the local militia, and the default venue for any and all public meetings. The colonial tavern was the Swiss Army knife of public buildings, and the tavern keeper, or publican, was often one of the most respected and well-informed men in town. The drinks menu evolved too. While English-style ale was certainly brewed, it was soon joined by other, more uniquely American beverages. The apple orchards that flourished in the New England climate made cider, hard cider, ubiquitous and cheap. It was the everyday drink, consumed by the tankardful. But the real fuel of the colonial economy, and its taverns, was rum. The colonies were a key part of the infamous triangular trade. New England ships would carry rum to West Africa to trade for enslaved people, who were then taken to the sugar plantations of the West Indies. The molasses produced on those plantations was then shipped back to New England to be distilled into more rum. It was a dark and brutal economy, but it filled the barrels in every colonial tavern from Boston to Charleston, and the colonists did wonderfully inventive things with their rum. This brings us to a fantastically quirky creation known as flip. This wasn't a drink you'd want to order if your bartender was in a hurry. The tavern keeper would start with a large mug, into which he'd pour strong beer, a generous slug of rum, and a sweetener like sugar or molasses. He might even beat an egg into it. The magic came from the fireplace. A proper tavern hearth would have several iron rods called loggerheads, their ends resting in the roaring fire, glowing cherry red. The publican would take one of these scorching hot loggerheads and plunge it directly into the mug of beer and rum. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A loud hiss, a plume of fragrant steam, and a violent frothing as the intense heat caramelized the sugars and cooked the mixture into a thick, warm, creamy beverage with a slightly bitter, burnt taste. It was by all accounts delicious, deeply fortifying, and absurdly potent. A colonial winter warmer that was a spectacle in its own right. The cozy, rum-scented atmosphere of these taverns, however, was destined to become the backdrop for a continental political drama. For more than a century, Britain had governed its American colonies with a policy that one statesman described as salutary neglect. The crown was an ocean away, and as long as the colonies were sending raw materials home and buying finished goods, London was content to let them mostly govern themselves. This all changed after Untitled. Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, a truly global conflict that had secured its dominance over France. But victory was ruinously deep in debt. Parliament in London looked to the American colonies, which had benefited from the victory, and decided it was time for them to pay their fair share for their own defense. This led to a series of taxes that were deeply resented in the colonies, not just for the economic cost, but for the principle. The Stamp Act of 1830, which taxed all paper goods from legal documents to playing cards, was met with organized out. And where was this outrage organized? In the taverns. Unlike in England, where the publican was now an agent of the state, in America he was a pillar of the local community. The tavern became the unofficial headquarters of the opposition. It was where the latest inflammatory pamphlets from radical writers like Thomas Paine would be read aloud to the illiterate. It was where merchants gathered to agree on boycotts of British goods. The Sons of Liberty, a secret society of patriots, didn't hold their meetings in a public hall where royalist spies might be watching. They met in the back rooms and private upstairs chambers of sympathetic taverns. The city of Boston was the undisputed cauldron of this revolutionary fervor, and its most famous political crucible was a tavern on Union Street, known as the Green Dragon. This was a well-known mainstream fact of American history, taught to every schoolchild, with a large, menacing-looking copper dragon hanging over its door. The Green Dragon hosted the political clubs, lodges, and committees that formed the backbone of the resistance. Men like Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock were all regulars. The revolutionary statesman Daniel Webster would later call it the headquarters of the revolution. Content contains sensitive material. Please remove content contains sensitive material. Still, it was here, in the winter of 1773, that the most iconic act of colonial defiance was planned. Parliament had passed the Tea Act, which, while actually lowering the price of tea, gave the struggling British East India Company a monopoly, undercutting the colonial merchants and smugglers. In the eyes of the colonists, it was a trick to get them to accept the principle of parliamentary taxation. On the night of December 16th, hundreds of men gathered in and around the Green Dragon Tavern. In its dimly lit rooms, fueled by draughts of cider or flip, they finalized their audacious plan. They emerged from the tavern, disguised as Mohawk Indians, a gesture to proclaim that they were no longer Englishmen, but something new, something American, and marched down to Griffin's Wharf. There, they boarded 3 ships, and famously dumped 342 chests of British tea into the harbor. It was an act of political theater and defiance planned and launched from the warm, noisy belly of a pub. But as with any beloved historical narrative, there is complexity. It remains a subject of discussion among historians just how democratic these revolutionary taverns really were. Were they truly egalitarian spaces where the farmhand and the wealthy merchant were equals? The romantic image suggests so, but the reality was more layered. While men of different classes did mix in taverns in a way that was rare elsewhere, unspoken hierarchies were ever present. Most taverns had a company room reserved for gentlemen, separate from the common taproom. The tavern keeper would certainly show more deference to a man of property than to a simple laborer. Furthermore, these cradles of liberty were cradles almost exclusively for white men. A woman's presence in a tavern, unless she was the owner or a servant, was socially suspect. Enslaved people were only present as property or as labor, and free black colonists and Native Americans were systematically excluded from these hotbeds of political discourse. So, while the tavern was undeniably instrumental in fomenting a revolution based on the idea of liberty, it also reflected the profound limitations of who was included in that vision of liberty at its inception. The conversation that began in English alehouses, a conversation of community and identity, had crossed an ocean. The old framework of royal control had failed, and in its place, the American tavern had become a revolutionary engine, transforming whispers of dissent into a declaration that would change the world. The revolutionary engine of the American tavern, which had successfully unseated the power of a king and an empire, did not simply sputter out after the war was won. Its spirit of defiant community building rode westward with the young nation. As the frontier was pushed from the Appalachians to the Rockies and finally to the Pacific, the colonial tavern was reborn, transformed by the dust and grit of the West into an institution of mythic proportions. The saloon, when you picture it, you likely see the classic Hollywood image. A crude, false-fronted building on a muddy street with swinging batwing doors that offer just a glimpse of the smoky interior. Inside, a long polished bar, a mirror of questionable quality behind it, brass spittoons on the floor, and a grim-faced bartender who has seen it all. This picture, while romanticized, isn't entirely wrong. In the brand new, often lawless boomtowns that sprang up around mines, cattle trails, and railroads, the saloon was the anchor of civilization. Like its colonial ancestor, it served a dizzying number of functions. It was the only place a dusty cowboy could get a warm meal, a place where a lonely miner could find human company, and the only social venue that wasn't a church. It was also the town's informal bank, where gold dust could be weighed and exchanged. It was the post office and the hiring hall. Deals were sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared shot of whiskey, a spirit that had become far more common and American than imported rum. The saloon was the town's living room and its battlefield, a place where fortunes were made at the poker table, and lives were lost in a flash of temper. It represented both the promise of community and the ever-present threat of chaos. But the saloon's political power found its truest and most complex expression not in the sparse and violent West, but in the crowded, teeming cities of the East. During the late Sturjold and early Erst centuries, waves of immigrants poured into America from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe. They arrived often with nothing, speaking little English, and facing a bewildering and frequently hostile new world. For these newcomers, the neighborhood saloon was not a den of vice. It was a lifeline. Here, the saloon keeper was not a stranger, but a landsman, someone from the old country. Pizza, an Irish immigrant, could find a publican in Boston who not only spoke with a familiar brogue, but could also help him find a job on the docks, cash his paycheck, read him a letter from his family back home, and perhaps most importantly, extend him a line of credit. German immigrants, with their deep-rooted beer garden traditions, established saloons that were family-friendly community centers, places for singing clubs, and the saloon was a crucial, informal social safety net in a country that had yet to develop a formal one. This brings us to a well-known historical fact about this era: the saloon's deep integration with the machinery of urban politics. The saloon extra bake. For a political organization like New York's Tammany Hall, the Irish saloon was its primary base of operations. The local ward boss would often run his affairs from a favored pub. It was here that he dispensed patronage. Jobs: a basket of food for a struggling family, a bucket of coal in the winter, in exchange for what he needed most: votes. The saloon became a voter registration center and the heart of the get-out-the-vote effort on election day. For a new citizen, loyalty to the local political machine, cemented over a pint of beer in the neighborhood saloon, was a matter of simple, pragmatic survival. The state had created an immigrant underclass, and the saloon helped them organize into a formidable political force. This growing power, however, created a powerful backlash. The very things that made the saloon essential to immigrant communities: the alcohol, the foreign languages, the backroom political deals, made it a target for a rising tide of native-born, middle-class Protestant reformers. This gave birth to the powerful temperance movement. Advocates for temperance saw the saloon as the source of nearly every social evil. It was, in their view, a diabolical machine that took a working man's wages and gave him back poverty, that broke apart families through domestic abuse, and that corrupted the nation's politics with its vote-buying and immigrant-based machine politics. This movement produced one of American history's most fascinating and quirky figures, Carrie Nation. She was not a woman who believed in gentle persuasion. A devout and formidable figure, standing 6 feet tall, Nation believed she was divinely ordained to destroy the joints that sold liquor. Beginning around Untitled, she began what she called her hatchetations. Dressed in severe black, she would march into a saloon, often accompanied by a group of hymn-singing female followers, and proceed to smash the place to bits with a hatchet. She would shatter the bar mirror, split the wooden bar itself, and smash every bottle of liquor she could reach, all while praying and scolding the terrified patrons and barkeep. She was arrested over censor times and became a national spectacle, selling souvenir hatchets to fund her travels. While often seen as an eccentric, her direct action approach tapped into a deep well of female frustration over the destructive power of alcohol on their homes and families. This is where our story takes another crucial turn, intertwining the battle over the saloon with the equally momentous struggle for women's suffrage. The leaders of the suffrage movement, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, quickly realized they had a potential, if complicated, ally in the temperance movement. It remains a point of considerable debate among historians whether this alliance was a matter of pure pragmatism or shared ideology. Was it simply a marriage of convenience, where suffragettes saw the vast, raucous, organized numbers of temperance advocates as a powerful bloc to be won over? Or was it a more natural partnership, rooted in a shared progressive era belief that women, as the moral guardians of the nation, were needed in the political sphere to clean up the mess men had made? Regardless of the motive, the strategic logic was undeniable. Suffrage leaders argued that if women were granted the vote, their first act would be to outlaw alcohol and dismantle the corrupt saloon-based political machines. This argument activated a fearsome opponent, the powerful and wealthy liquor lobby. Brewers, distillers, and saloon owners associations, terrified of prohibition, funneled enormous amounts of money into anti-suffrage campaigns. They published pamphlets, bribed politicians, and spread propaganda claiming that giving women the vote would disrupt the natural order and destroy the family. For decades, the political might of the alcohol industry was one of the single greatest barriers to women gaining the right to vote. The fight for the ballot box became inseparable from the battle over the swinging doors of the saloon. So, the momentum, however, was under the combined forces of the Anti-Saloon League, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the National Suffrage Associations created a political juggernaut. When America entered World War I in Untitled, the final pieces fell into place. Temperance was successfully framed as a patriotic duty. The grain used to make beer and whiskey, they argued, was needed to feed the troops. Anti-German sentiment was weaponized against the large German-American brewers like Pabst, Schlitz, and Anheuser-Busch. Finally, in Untitled, the Sherbath Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. A year later, the Schuylkill Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. The tavern, which had once midwifed a revolution to create the American government, had become so politically charged that this same government was now mobilized to destroy it entirely. The lights, it seemed, had finally gone out on the public house. The triumph of the temperance movement in America, which succeeded in writing prohibition into the Constitution, was supposed to be the final moral victory. The saloon, that source of urban corruption and private misery, was declared dead. But a strange thing happened when the government tried to turn off the tap for an entire nation. The tavern did not die. It simply went underground and became infinitely more glamorous. For every legal saloon that was shuttered, a dozen illegal speakeasies bloomed in the shadows. The term itself whispered of the secrecy required. You had to speak easy or quietly about such a place, lest the authorities overhear. Finding a speakeasy was part of the thrill. You might need a password whispered through a slot in a reinforced door, or you might enter through a fake storefront, perhaps a florist or a undertaker. Inside, the old rules were gone. The boisterous, all-male world of the saloon was replaced by a more sophisticated and illicit atmosphere. For the first time, respectable women were not only present but welcome. Flappers in their short dresses danced the Charleston with men in sharp suits, all while sipping cocktails. And what cocktails they were! The illicitly produced alcohol, often called bathtub gin or rot-gut whiskey, was notoriously harsh. The art of the cocktail, with its elaborate use of fruit juices, sodas, and bitters, exploded during Prohibition, not just for style, but as a practical necessity to mask the taste of badly made spirits. In a great historical irony, Prohibition actually succeeded in uniting social classes, in a way the old saloon never could. Everyone was now a criminal. The wealthy banker and the struggling clerk, the factory worker and the debutante, could all find themselves rubbing shoulders in a crowded, smoky speakeasy, bound by a shared conspiracy of thirst. Of course, this mass civil disobedience was a gift to organized crime. Mobsters like Al Capone built vast empires on illegal brewing and smuggling, protecting their turf with terrifying violence. The very law designed to purify the nation's soul had ended up creating a golden age for the gangster. The government's attempt to legislate the tavern out of existence had failed spectacularly, turning it from a simple watering hole into a symbol of rebellion against the state itself. By each Jubites on the sun, the nation had had enough. The Great Depression was in full swing, and the arguments for prohibition rang hollow. The government desperately needed the tax revenue from legal alcohol sales, and the public was tired of the crime and hypocrisy. The Arthur E. Saint Amendment repealed the shoe bath, and drinking was once again legal. But the American tavern that re-emerged was a changed creature. It was tamer, more heavily regulated, stripped of the raw political power it had once held. The swaggering, swinging-door saloon of the Old West was gone, replaced by the more subdued bar and grill, a place more focused on food and decorum than on organizing the ward vote. Meanwhile, back across the ocean in Britain, the pub's political life had never been interrupted. Its lineage from the medieval alehouse remained unbroken, and it settled into its role as the unofficial stage of British political life. This became a powerful and enduring trope, especially in the age of mass media. For a modern politician, being photographed enjoying a pint of beer in a traditional pub became a vital piece of political performance art. It was a visual shorthand meant to convey that they were not some aloof elite from Westminster, but a man of the people, someone you could have a normal conversation with down the local. From prime ministers lifting a tankard for the cameras to party leaders campaigning in working men's clubs, the pub became a mandatory stop on the trail. This is a tradition that continues to this day, though sometimes with slightly cringy results, as politicians who clearly don't know how to hold a pint glass properly are mercilessly mocked by the press. It is a testament to the pub's enduring symbolic power as a place of authentic, common man identity. Some figures have built their entire political persona around this image. Perhaps the most famous contemporary example is Nigel Farage, the British politician who was instrumental in the campaign for Brexit. He was rarely seen in public without a pint in his hand, holding court in a pub like a modern-day ward boss, positioning himself as the voice of the common Englishman against the out-of-touch elites in London and Brussels. And even in America, the echo of the tavern's political role can be heard in events like the Arsène Ling-Joe Beer Summit, when President Barack Obama invited a black Harvard professor and the white police sergeant who had arrested him to the White House to discuss race relations over a few bottles of beer, a tacit admission that some conversations are best had in the informal spirit of the public house. And sepultal fime the tenfree. And now, for one last wonderfully quirky fact to round out our journey. Despite the pub's deep association with drinking, it is still, technically, illegal to be drunk in a pub in the United Kingdom. This is not a joke. under Section J of the Licensing Act of 1846, a piece of high Victorian legislation born from the anxieties of the temperance movement. It is an offence for any person to be found drunk on licensed premises. The law is rarely enforced, of course, but it remains on the books, a ghostly echo of Carrie Nation's hatchet, a legal fossil, reminding us that the state has long sought to control not just the space, but the very state of mind of the people inside it. This brings us to our final, lingering question, a point of contention among social historians. Today, what is the role of the pub in the recent century? The forces aligned against it: high taxes on beer, changing social habits, and the decline of traditional industries have led to thousands of pubs closing across Britain. In America, the neighborhood bar competes with endless forms of digital entertainment. Many of the gritty, historic pubs that served as community centers for centuries have been replaced by gastropubs, bright, airy establishments with chalkboard menus, charcuterie boards, and eye-watering prices for a pint of craft IPA. It remains a scholarly debate whether these are the true successors of the public house, or if they are simply restaurants with a good beer list. Has the essential function of the tavern as a place for information exchange, social bonding, and political discourse been permanently outsourced to social media? Can a Facebook group truly replace the rich, chaotic, face-to-face community of the corner pub? As our journey comes to a close tonight, the answer is probably no. The digital world, for all its reach, lacks the texture, the warmth, the shared physical space that has defined the public house for 2,000 years. From the Roman soldier sharing a dusty cup of wine at a taberna, to the Anglo-Saxon farmer seeking warmth at the alewife's stake, from the Sons of Liberty plotting treason at the Green Dragon, to the immigrant finding a foothold in a new world in a noisy saloon, the tavern has always been more than just a place to drink. It is a stage, a shelter, a listening post, and a crucible. It is a place where communities are forged and defended, where private troubles and public affairs have always mingled. It's a history that is still being written every time someone pushes through the door, finds a seat, and begins a conversation. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in the world can begin with the simple, quiet clink of a glass on a well-worn table. The loom that wove together slavery, factories, and feminism, before the roar of the factory, before the steam and the iron and the relentless noise, there was a quiet rhythm, a gentle, percussive beat that filled households for thousands upon thousands of years. It was the sound of the loom. Cluck-cluck, shh, cluck-cluck, shh. Picture a small, sun-drenched room in ancient Egypt, or perhaps a dimly lit stone cottage in medieval France. The air is thick, with a dusty, sweet smell of raw wool or linen. In the center of this room sits a person, most often a woman, before a frame of wood. This is the hand loom, an invention so ancient, so fundamental, that its origins are lost to the mists of prehistory. Fragments of its work, of woven textiles, have been found dating back tens of thousands of years, a testament to a skill that is as old as civilization itself. For most of its long life, the loom was not a symbol of industry, but of home, of patience, of the slow, deliberate transformation of tangled fibers into something of order, beauty, and use. The principle behind this ancient craft is deceptively simple. It is an act of creating order from chaos, one thread at a time. Imagine two sets of threads. The first set, the warp, is stretched taut on the loom, held under tension like the strings of a harp. These threads form the skeleton of the fabric, the strong, unmoving foundation. The second thread, the weft, is the traveler. It is wound around a shuttle, a small, boat-shaped piece of wood. The weaver's magic is to pass this weft thread over and under the rigid warp threads, again and again, over, under, over, under. To make this dance possible, the weaver has pedals or levers that control heddles, thin wires or cords, each holding a warp thread. With a press of the foot, half of the warp threads lift, creating a small, triangular tunnel called the shed. Through this fleeting opening, the weaver sends the shuttle flying. Clack, the shuttle, carrying the weft, emerges on the other side. The weaver then uses a reed, which looks like a large, flat comb, to beat that new weft thread snugly into place. Shish whiz. Then, with another press of the foot, the raised threads lower and the lowered threads rise, locking the weft into the fabric's embrace. Then it begins again. Clack, clack, shh. A new shed opens and the shuttle journeys back. For millennia, this was the pace of production, the pace of a human heartbeat. The width of any fabric was limited by how far a single person could comfortably throw the shuttle from one hand to the other. It was an intimate, human-scale operation. This process gave us everything. It gave us the sailcloth that carried Phoenician traders across the Mediterranean and the heavy wool that cloaked Roman legionaries. It gave us delicate silks that graced the shoulders of Chinese nobility and the humble linen used to swaddle a newborn child. Before this machine began to think for itself, it was an extension of human will, powered by muscle, guided by eye, and paced by a quiet patience. It was a process so fundamental to daily existence that one has to wonder what people even complained about before their Wi-Fi signal dropped. Probably a knotted thread. The status of these ancient weavers is a soft point of contention among historians. In some societies, the woman at the loom was seen simply as a domestic laborer, her work as essential but unremarkable as cooking or cleaning. In others, she was the guardian of a sacred art, a creator of wealth and status. We have depictions on Greek vases of Penelope at her loom, the very image of wifely devotion and cunning, using her weaving to hold a kingdom together. It remains a gentle debate whether the weaver was perceived as a household servant or as the revered manager of a family's most visible asset, its textiles. For most of history, this slow, steady rhythm was enough. But humanity, as it is never quite satisfied with enough. The first tremor, the first hint of the earthquake to come, arrived not with steam, but with a simple, ingenious bit of wood and wire. In Taverns, a weaver and inventor from Lancashire, England, named John Kay, patented something called the flying shuttle. It seems a small thing. Kay's invention put the shuttle on wheels and attached it to a cord. Now, instead of throwing it by hand, a weaver could simply tug the cord, and the shuttle would shoot across the loom, through the shed, all on its own. Flick thwump. Flick thwump. This small innovation had two enormous consequences. First, it allowed a single weaver to create fabrics far wider than their own arm span. Second, it dramatically increased the speed of the process. The quiet, meditative clack-clack was replaced by a sharper, faster cadence. One weaver could now do the work of two, and do it more quickly. It was the first ghost in the machine, a simple mechanism that began to outpace the human body it was built to serve. Naturally, weavers were not entirely thrilled with this development. Many saw it not as a helper, but as a threat to their livelihood. Mobs of angry weavers attacked Kay's home, and he was eventually forced to flee to France, a prophet of automation without honor in his own country. They could feel a change in the air, a shift in the delicate balance between human skill and mechanical efficiency. The very thing that had been a part of the home for eons was starting to feel alien. This fear was not unfounded. It was rooted in a deep understanding that the loom was more than just a tool. Weaving was a language. The patterns, the quality of the cloth, they told stories about a person's wealth, their village, their heritage. Consider, for a moment, the strange and incredibly luxurious fabric known as sea silk or byssus. This was a textile spun not from wool or cotton, but from the long, silky filaments that a particular type of Mediterranean clam, the Pinna nobilis, uses to anchor itself to the seabed. It was a maddeningly difficult material to harvest and weave, and the resulting fabric shimmered with an iridescent gold. was lighter than air and was said to be immune to fire. The secrets of making it were passed down through a very small number of women, them to four, primarily on the island of Sardinia. To own a garment of byssus was to own something almost mythical. It's the sort of obscure luxury that reminds you that before mass production, the most valuable things were often defined by their sheer impossibility. The flying shuttle, of course, cared nothing for myths or tradition. It was pure function, and it created a new, critical bottleneck. Now that weaving was so much for the spinners, the women who painstakingly drew fibers into thread with their spinning wheels couldn't keep up. The looms sat hungry and idle, waiting for thread. An imbalance had been introduced. Brr! The ancient, harmonious relationship between spinner and weaver was broken. The machine was asking for more, and so a question began to hang heavy in the workshops of England. The first gear had turned. A single, crucial part of the process had been automated. If a simple cord and shuttle could speed up the weaver, what else could be done? What if you could build a loom that didn't just pass the shuttle, but lifted the heddles, beat the weft, and advanced the cloth all on its own? What if you could build a loom that didn't need a weaver's feet to dance on the pedals, or their hands to guide the thread? What would such a machine look like? What would it eat? And, most importantly, what would it do to the quiet, human world it was about to be born into? The ghost in the machine was about to get a body, and it would be made of iron. The hunger of John Kay's flying shuttle created a problem that echoed through the hills of Lancashire. The looms were too fast, and the spinners, with their slow, graceful spinning wheels, could not keep pace. For a few brief decades, it was the spinners who were in command, their skill in high demand. But industry, like nature, abhors a vacuum and a series of inventions. The spinning jenny, the water frame, the spinning mule, soon answered the call. These machines, powered first by hand and then by river, began to churn out thread at a rate previously unimaginable, miles upon miles of it. The balance had shifted once more. Now, it was the weavers who were overwhelmed. All this thread, and not enough hands to weave it. The stage was perfectly set for someone to answer the question that hung in the air. How do you build a loom that can weave by itself? The man who would sketch the blueprint for this new age was, rather amusingly, not a weaver, nor an engineer, nor even a mechanic. He was a clergyman and a sometime poet from Nottinghamshire named Edmund Cartwright. In Echen Tibite Buttersus, Cartwright found himself on holiday, listening to a group of Manchester businessmen discussing the recent advancements in spinning. They concluded that while automating spinning was one thing, building a mechanical loom was an absurd fantasy, a feat of complexity far too great to be mechanized. Cartwright, who confessed he had never even seen a hand loom up close, apparently took this as a personal challenge. It's one of history's great examples of an expert telling someone a thing is impossible, only for the fool, blissfully unaware of the complexities, to go and do it anyway. His first attempt was a clumsy, gargantuan beast of wood. It moved with the grace of a falling staircase, and required the strength of two powerful men just to operate, all while making a fabric that a medieval peasant would have probably rejected. It was, by any practical measure, a failure. But it worked. It proved the principle: a machine powered by something other than a human weaver could, in fact, weave cloth. A new patent was filed in Echen Tibite Batwu. The ghost in the machine now had a body, albeit a very awkward one. Cartwright set up a factory in Doncaster, populating it with his strange, lumbering looms, first powered by a horse and later by a steam engine. Yet this early vision of the future was not met with applause. It was met with fire. His factory, along with the dreams of a quick profit, burned to the ground in Echen Tibite Jusae, an act of arson widely believed to have been carried out by handloom weavers. who saw this iron creature as the mechanical embodiment of their own extinction. Once again, a pioneer of automation found that the people whose jobs he was simplifying did not send thank you notes, but the idea was out. Cartwright's design, though flawed, was a foundation upon which others would build. Over the next 30 years, inventors and machinists across England would refine the power loom, swapping its wooden frame for unyielding iron, fine-tuning its gears, and increasing its speed and reliability. By the Echen Barbite artisans, the power loom had become a sleek, efficient, and formidable machine, and it was no longer a standalone oddity. It was being gathered by the hundreds and then thousands into colossal brick buildings called mills. These looms were connected by a forest of leather belts to a single, titanic power source, the steam engine, the thudding iron heart of the Industrial Revolution. The gentle, rhythmic beat of the hand loom was gone, drowned out by the deafening, earth-shaking thunder of 1,000 iron weavers working in perfect, terrible unison. This iron weaver was a picky eater. It lacked the nuanced touch of a human hand. It could not easily handle the delicate, variable fibers of wool or linen. Silk was far too expensive for this new world of mass production. But cotton was perfect. The fibers were relatively strong, uniform, and behaved predictably in the unthinking grasp of the machine. And the new mills of Manchester, with their ever-growing legions of power looms, developed a voracious, insatiable appetite for raw cotton, and the world turned its eyes to a place where cotton grew exceptionally well: the American South. Here we must pause and take another slow breath, because the thread we are following, the one that began in a sunlit cottage, is about to lead us into one of history's darkest rooms. In the late shoebath century, American cotton was a limited crop. Its most common variety was stubbornly difficult. The fluffy fiber, the lint, was tangled with small, sticky green seeds. To separate them by hand was painstaking work. An enslaved worker, toiling from sunup to sundown, could clean, on average, just 1 single pound of cotton fiber a day. This agonizingly slow process was the great bottleneck that kept cotton from becoming a global king. Slavery was, of course, already a horrific and deeply entrenched institution in the American South, America and rice cultivation, but its profitability was showing signs of waning. Some of the founding fathers spoke, however hypocritically, of a future where the institution might wither away. Then, in Echen Barbite, another inventor, this one, an American named Eli Whitney, created a machine that would seal the fate of millions. The cotton gin being short for engine, was brutally simple. It was essentially a wooden drum with rows of small wire hooks that dragged the wrecked cotton fibers through a mesh screen too fine for the seeds to pass through. A single person operating a small, hand-cranked gin could now clean 50 pounds of cotton in a day. The bottleneck was smashed. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The dream that slavery might fade away evaporated. The institution wasn't just saved, it became more profitable, more brutal, and more central to the American economy than ever before. For Southern planters, the cotton gin and the power loom were a license to print money. A vicious and deadly synergy was born. The power looms of England, hungry for cheap cotton, created limitless demand. The cotton gin, capable of processing huge volumes, enabled a limitless supply. The only missing ingredient was land and labor, taken by force. This set off a land rush into the deep South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and a horrifying expansion of what became known as the Second Middle Passage. This was the domestic slave trade, a forced migration that saw over 1 million enslaved people from the Port Rook, Upper South, sold down the river to the new cotton plantations. Families were shattered, people treated as mere agricultural inputs, their lives consumed to feed the ravenous iron weavers. An ocean away, the faster the looms of Manchester clattered, the more land was cleared, in Mississippi, the more fabric that flooded the European market, the higher the price of an enslaved man, woman, or child at the auction blocks of New Orleans. It is a point that still prompts debate among historians, a dark chicken and egg question of industrial evil. Did the technology of the power loom and cotton gin cause this massive expansion of slavery, or did it merely provide the tools for a rapacious desire for wealth that was already there? It's a chilling calculus, trying to weigh the motive of greed against the opportunity of invention. Either way, the loom was now inextricably yoked to the institution of slavery. The clean, cheap cotton garments appearing in shops around the world were woven with a thread spun from human suffering. Abolitionists at the time were keenly aware of this. They circulated pamphlets showing diagrams of slaves packed into ships, side by side with advertisements for cotton dresses, making a connection that many consumers would have preferred to ignore. In a fascinatingly early example of ethical consumerism, some abolitionist groups even promoted boycotts of slave-grown cotton, urging shoppers to seek out free labor textiles from other parts of the world. Like India, the ancient, quiet loom had been a tool of the home. The new, iron power loom was a titan of the factory, a machine whose hunger pangs were felt across the globe, driving the horrors of the slave trade to new and terrible depths. It sat in the dark, loud mills of England, waiting. It had its food source, a seemingly endless supply of white gold from the American South. Still, it had its power, the churning heart of the steam engine. All it needed now was a minder, a new kind of worker to tend to its needs, to scurry between its iron ribs, and to piece together the threads it so frequently broke. It needed an army of cheap, disposable labor, and it would find one in the people who had always been the loom's primary companions: women. The iron weaver sat waiting in its vast brick hall. Its gears were oiled, its steam-powered heart was beating, and its appetite for southern cotton was seemingly endless. All it needed was an attendant, a new kind of worker to bridge the gap between raw material and finished cloth. The job description was demanding. It required long hours, unwavering focus, and the dexterity to work amidst a thunderous and often dangerous maze of machinery. But most importantly, it needed to be cheap, and the factory owners of the early shoe-jolt century knew exactly where to look. They turned to the loom's oldest companions, women. From the dawn of weaving, the loom had been primarily the domain of women. It was seen as domestic work, an extension of the household. The mill owners, in a stroke of what they surely saw as brilliant logic, simply extended this tradition into their new industrial world. The official reasoning was that women and children, with their smaller, supposedly more nimble fingers, were better suited to tying broken threads and managing the delicate spindles. Official and far more accurate reason was that they could be paid a fraction of what a man would demand for the same work. They were seen as a more docile, more manageable, and above all, a more affordable workforce. And so, it was the daughters, sisters, and wives of farmers and laborers who left their homes and walked into the deafening roar of the future. The world they entered was an alien landscape. Nothing in human history had prepared them for the inside of a textile mill. The air itself was a thick fog, choked with airborne cotton fibers, what the workers called white dust, that coated every surface and filled every lung. The noise was a physical presence, a constant, concussive boom and clatter from hundreds of looms that made conversation impossible and slowly stole one's hearing. It was a place of relentless motion, a blur of spinning spindles and shuttles flying back and forth at impossible speeds. Everywhere, a moment of lost focus could mean a hand crushed in a gear, a scalp torn by a drive belt, or worse. The work was monotonous and exhausting. Standing for 12 to 14 hours a day, performing the same few tasks over and over. This was not the mindful, rhythmic weaving of their ancestors. This was servitude to the machine. Nowhere was this new social experiment more famously tried than in Lowell, Massachusetts. In the Etienne Barbet Arces and Sanches, A group of Boston investors built a massive complex of textile mills, envisioning a kind of industrial utopia. They recruited a workforce of young, unmarried women from the farms of New England, who would come to be known as the Lowell Mill Girls. It was a grand and perhaps briefly sincere vision. The owners built clean, supervised boarding houses for the women. They offered lectures, evening classes, and access to a library. It was meant to be a respectable, morally upright place for a young woman to work before marriage, a place where she could earn her own money while being culturally enriched. For a time, it was even a point of pride, a tourist destination where visitors could marvel at both the technology of the mills and the virtue of their workers. This grand experiment gave us one of the most fascinating and quirky tidbits of the entire industrial era, a literary magazine written, edited, and published entirely by the female factory workers themselves. It was called the Lowell Offering. Between grueling 14-hour shifts in the dust and the din, these women wrote poetry, essays, and stories. Their writings offer a breathtaking window into their minds. They wrote of homesickness, of the beauty of nature they missed, of their intellectual ambitions. They did not write much about boys or fashion. They wrote about Greek philosophy and the moral implications of industrialization. It's a humbling thought, really, that in the midst of some of the most punishing labor imaginable, these women carved out the time and mental space to debate Plato. But the utopian dream of Lowell, like all utopias, could not survive contact with the demands of capitalism. As competition increased, mill owners began to squeeze. They cut wages, they increased the rent at the boarding houses, and most significantly, they implemented the stretch out, a practice where each woman was made responsible for tending more and more looms, multiplying the pace of their work without any increase in pay. It's the 20th century equivalent of your boss telling you to answer a colleague's emails in addition to your own, while also operating a forklift. And this is where our story takes its next crucial turn. These women, who were hired because they were expected to be quiet and compliant, did something that the factory owners never anticipated. They fought back. In Ich en Botbite Sensor Seuss, and again in Ich en Botbite Sensor Luke, the mill girls of Lowell went on strike. They walked out of the factories, they organized, they held rallies, and they formed the Factory Girls Association, one of the first unions of working women in American history. They signed petitions demanding a 10-hour workday, protesting the wage cuts that they called an insult to their dignity. "We will not be slaves," they declared, a phrase that crackled with the political electricity of the time, deliberately linking their economic struggle to the abolitionist cause many of them supported. Historians still debate the true legacy of the mill girl experience. Was it an exploitative trap that chewed up young women for profit? Or was it a genuinely liberating step, offering them a chance at economic independence and a life outside the confines of the family farm? The truth, as it often is, likely lies somewhere in the complex space between those two poles. The work was brutal, but for many, it was the first time they had their own money, the first time they lived in a community of their peers, away from patriarchal control. What is not debatable is that the act of organizing to fight the machine's owners changed them, and in doing so, planted a critical seed for the future of feminism. On the factory floor and on the picket line, these sisters of the spindle learned that they had a collective voice. They learned how to organize, how to petition, how to speak publicly, and how to articulate their worth in a world determined to devalue them. They were, in essence, receiving a practical education in political action. It's no coincidence that many of the women who passed through the mills of Lowell and other factory towns went on to become prominent figures in the abolitionist, the Warasees, temperance, and women's suffrage movements. They had looked the new industrial world in its iron face and learned they could make it listen. The loom, which had for so long been a quiet symbol of female domesticity, had ironically become the engine that brought women out of the home, concentrated their power, and taught them the language of organized resistance. The thread of our story is now leading away from the factory floor and into the future, a future shaped by the loom's final and perhaps most profound lesson: automation itself. The walkouts and protests of the Lowell Mill girls were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a conversation, one that is still happening today, about the human cost of progress. The loom had brought women together, given them a taste of economic freedom, and then inadvertently taught them the power of collective action. But the machine itself was not finished evolving. It had one last astonishing trick up its sleeve, one final transformation that would carry its logic out of the factory and into the very fabric of our modern, digital lives. The ghost in the machine was about to learn how to read. To understand this leap, we have to look to France and to a device perfected in Etienne-Barbite-Lindsay by a weaver named Joseph Marie Jacquard. The Jacquard loom was designed to solve one of the most complex challenges in weaving, creating intricate, repeating patterns like brocades and damasks. To do this on a hand loom required immense skill and concentration, often involving an assistant, usually a child, whose job was to manually lift the correct sequence of warp threads for every single pass of the shuttle. It was an incredibly slow and error-prone process. Jacquard's genius was to automate that child. He created a system where the instructions for the pattern were encoded onto a series of stiff cards. These cards had rows of holes punched into them. As the cards fed through the loom's mechanism, a set of needles would test for holes. Where there was a hole, the needle passed through, and a hook would lift the corresponding warp thread. Where there was no hole, the needle was blocked, and the thread stayed down. By stringing these cards together in a long chain, the loom could read the pattern and reproduce it flawlessly, over and over again. It was a revolution. The loom was no longer just a machine of brute force. It was a machine that followed a program. It was executing code. This programmable loom gave rise to some wonderfully strange, artistic creations. This was just weaving floral patterns. Some weavers created incredibly detailed jacquard portraits, silk tapestries that were startlingly accurate reproductions of paintings or engravings. Imagine sitting for a portrait, not for a painter, but for a technician who would translate the lines of your face into a series of punch cards, which would then be fed to a machine that would weave your likeness into shimmering fabric. It was one of the earliest, most tangible forms of digital imaging, a ghostly precursor to the pixels on the screen you're looking at now. And this is where the thread of our story weaves itself into the heart of our modern world. In the Etienne-Barbite centuries, an English mathematician and visionary named Charles Babbage was wrestling with a design for his analytical engine, a mechanical, general-purpose computer that was, tragically, a century ahead of its time. When searching for a way to feed complex instructions into his proposed engine of gears and levers, he looked to the Jacquard loom. The punch cards, he realized, were the perfect method for inputting not just numbers, but logical commands. The loom that wove silk patterns had provided the missing link for a machine that could weave algebraic ones. Babbage's collaborator, the brilliant mathematician Ada Lovelace, saw the full potential of this connection. She understood that if a machine could be programmed to manipulate threads based on holes in a card, it could be programmed to manipulate any symbol, be it a number, a letter, or a musical note. It was she who is credited with writing the world's first computer algorithm, a true descendant of the textile arts. Though Babbage's engine was never fully built, the idea of punch card programming endured. It was used by Herman Hollerith to tabulate the Etienne-Barbite U.S. census, and his company would eventually merge with others to become a small operation you might have heard of, IBM. For the first half of the earliest century, from accounting to code breaking, punch cards were the language of data. The digital ghost that first learned to read in a French weaving shed had now grown up left home, and gotten a job in information technology. And what of the iron weaver itself? It didn't disappear. It just grew faster, more automated, and more globally connected. Today, a modern textile mill is a cathedral of technological marvel. Enormous, computer-controlled looms operate at speeds that would have seemed like a form of black magic to Edmund Cartwright, managed by a handful of technicians who oversee a process that is almost entirely automated. The thirst for cheap cotton that fueled the transatlantic slave trade has been replaced by a thirst for every conceivable fiber, fueling the modern phenomenon of fast fashion. The cycle that began in Manchester has simply been outsourced. The same pressures to lower wages and increase speed that the Lowell mill girls faced are now felt by millions of garment workers, mostly women, in countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Cambodia. The legacy of the Sisters of the Spindle continues in their fight for safer working conditions and fair wages, a battle against a system that still prioritizes the machine's output over the workers' well-being. The fundamental anxieties created by that first flying shuttle are also still with us. We may no longer fear an iron loom taking over a weaver's cottage, but we talk constantly of AI replacing writers, algorithms replacing financial analysts, and robots replacing factory workers. Economists and sociologists still fervently disagree on whether this wave of automation will usher in an era of mass unemployment and social upheaval, or a new utopia of liberated human leisure. It seems we haven't changed much. We're just as worried about being made obsolete as the hand-loom weavers who threw stones at John Kay. So the next time you pull on a soft cotton t-shirt or wrap yourself in a blanket, take a moment, feel the simple, ancient pattern of the weave, the over and under of the warp and weft. That simple design contains multitudes. It holds the quiet patience of the ancient world. It holds the thunderous, earth-shaking birth of the factory and the dark legacy of the cotton gin. In its threads, you can find the courage of the mill girls who discovered their own power and the genius of a programmed card that taught machines how to think. That humble fabric is a map of the modern world, a world woven together, for better and for worse, by the loom, reek, the surprisingly political history of the fork. Before we can appreciate the fork's grand entrance, we must first visit the world it was about to disrupt. Let us travel back, past the age of restaurants and neatly packaged meals, to a medieval banquet hall in, say, a cool stone castle in a forested corner of France. The air is thick, alive with the smell of roasting meats, wood smoke from a great central hearth, and the slightly sweet aroma of spiced wine. Light sputters from torches set in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows on the tapestries that line the walls. Here at the high table, the lord and his family are dining, and how exactly are they eating? Mostly with a set of reliable, built-in, self-warming utensils that never get lost in a drawer. Their hands. The etiquette of the day is built entirely around this reality. A shared bowl of stewed meats and vegetables sits on the table, and diners reach in with the first few fingers of one hand, never the whole hand. That would be crude. To select a morsel, they tear chunks from loaves of bread to sop up the sauces. The primary tool laid at each place, if one is laid at all, is a spoon for navigating the treacherous world of broths and potages. The other essential utensil is a knife. This was a profoundly personal object. In an era before a host would provide cutlery, a person of any standing carried their own. This knife was a multi-tool. It sliced your share of meat from the communal roast, it speared a choice piece to bring it to your mouth, and in a pinch, it reminded the person sitting next to you to respect your personal space. Bringing your own sharp, pointed weapon to a dinner party wasn't a faux pas. It was expected. The table was a hands-on affair, a communal and often messy landscape governed by custom and the reach of one's own arm. Into this established world, our story's protagonist arrives, not with a bang, but with a quiet, metallic gleam. The fork, as we know it, was not a European invention. Its ancestors were large, two-pronged implements used for cooking and agriculture for millennia across the ancient world. Think of a farmer pitching hay or a cook holding a hot piece of meat over a fire. These were tools of the kitchen, not the table. The notion of a small, personal fork for eating was a refinement born in the sophisticated courts of the Persian Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium. It was in these opulent, refined cultures, with their love of luxury and intricate ceremony, that this delicate tool found its first champions. The most famous story of the fork's arrival in the West, the one that stands as its legendary origin moment, takes us to the shimmering, canal-laced city of Venice around the year C. A Byzantine princess, Theodora Anna Dukaina, traveled to the city to marry Domenico Selvo, the Doge, or leader, of the Venetian Republic. She brought with her a trousseau filled with the fineries of her homeland. She wrought, and among them was a case containing a tiny two-pronged fork made of gold. At her wedding feast, while the Venetian nobles around her were still skillfully maneuvering food with their fingers and personal knives, the new dogaressa produced her fork. An attendant would cut her food into small pieces, and she would then use the delicate implement to lift them to her mouth, avoiding any contact between her skin and her meal. The Venetian court, so the story goes, was not impressed. They were stunned. The reaction was a mixture of suspicion and scorn. This strange little object was seen as an absurd affectation. It was decadent, foreign, and almost insultingly delicate to the rough-hewn sensibilities of the European nobility. Eating with this miniature pitchfork was an act of profound and unnecessary otherness. What was wrong with the fingers and hands that God had given them? This tool seemed to create a strange, artificial distance from one's food, a barrier to the very basic, earthly pleasure of eating. The princess with her golden fork was marking herself as different, separate, and, in the eyes of many, sinfully proud. Of course, the tale of a single princess introducing a new technology is likely a convenient simplification. Historians still gently debate the fork's precise point of entry into the European consciousness. It is probable that merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims traveling back and forth from the East brought tales and even examples of the fork back with them on multiple occasions. Venice, as a major trading hub with deep connections to Byzantium, was undoubtedly a key port of entry for the idea. Yet, whether Theodora was truly the first or simply the most high-profile case, her story captures the essence of the fork's initial reception. It was not seen as a useful innovation, but as a bizarre and theatrical piece of foreign fussiness. It wasn't solving a problem, it was creating social awkwardness. Spuckers. It's the medieval equivalent of a guest showing up to a backyard barbecue and insisting on eating their hamburger with a specialized single-purpose tool they brought from home. Adding to its alien nature was the fact that these early forks were exclusively luxury items, made of gold or silver, often intricately decorated and kept in elaborate carrying cases called cadnas. They were tools for the 1% of the 1%. They were especially favored for eating messy, sticky foods that would otherwise soil the fingers. Things like preserved fruits in syrup, a delicacy of the time. This specific use gives us a clue to its early purpose. It wasn't about replacing the knife or the fingers entirely, but about managing very particular, high-status foods that could stain one's hands or, even worse, one's extravagantly expensive clothing. It was an accessory for the elite, a signal of wealth so immense that you required special tools just to eat your dessert. This strange, foreign object, with its two sharp tines and its air of superiority, had now landed on the Earth. It was viewed with distrust and derision. It was an uninvited guest, a conversation stopper, a tiny metallic symbol of a world far away. But simple scorn was just the beginning of its troubles. The fork was about to face an even more formidable enemy than the force of tradition. It was about to go on trial by God. Yum, the little golden fork, sitting there on the wedding banquet table, had caused a stir, but its troubles were only just beginning. Mere social awkwardness was one thing. Attracting the critical gaze of the medieval church was quite another. And that is precisely what happened. The fork was about to be put on trial, not in a court of law, but in the court of divine opinion, and the verdict was not favorable. The most famous condemnation comes from a man who witnessed that very scene with the Byzantine princess, Theodora. His name was Peter Damian, a formidable cardinal and later a saint, known for his stern, ascetic views. He watched the princess with her fastidious airs, her attendants, her perfumes, and, of course, her strange golden eating utensil. He saw not refinement, but a grotesque and sinful pride. He wrote that this woman's luxurious tastes were an affront to God. So when, some years later, she contracted a gruesome, degenerative disease, one which contemporary accounts describe with horrifying clarity, Damien did not see it as a tragedy. He saw it as a sermon. He declared her terrible death to be divine retribution for her vanity, proof that God Almighty had personally rejected her and her unnatural instrument. One does have to wonder about a worldview where your choice of cutlery could have such severe celestial consequences. This dramatic judgment became a powerful parable against the fork. For a church leader like Damien, the logic was simple and potent. God, in his infinite wisdom, had provided humanity with the perfect tools for eating. Their fingers, they were natural, they were effective, they were part of the body that God himself had created. To reject this gift in favor of a man-made, artificial instrument was an act of profound arrogance. It was to imply that God's design was somehow insufficient, that a mortal silversmith knew better than the divine creator. It was, in short, a tiny, glittering monument to the sin of pride. This was not merely a quirky opinion. It was a serious theological argument in a world where theology governed every aspect of life, from politics to plowing. And then there was the matter of its shape. The early dining forks were almost universally two-pronged. To the medieval mind, steeped in symbolism, this sharp, bifurcated form bore an unsettling resemblance to another, far more infamous pronged instrument, the pitchfork of the devil. This visual association was the devil was often depicted using his pitchfork to torment the souls of the damned in the fires of hell. Using a miniature version of this infernal tool to lift food to your lips was, well, it wasn't a good look. Preachers could easily cast the fork as the devil's tines, a satanic little implement that corrupted the soul, one bite at a time. It was a physical manifestation of worldly temptation, a tool that was both functionally and spiritually pointed. These powerful religious objections blended seamlessly with a deep-seated cultural suspicion for the martial aristocrats of Europe. The fork seemed hopelessly effeminate. Manliness was associated with the hearty, direct, hands-on approach to life. A true man gripped his sword firmly and ate his meat with the same confident directness. The fork, by contrast, was delicate. It was fussy. It demanded small, pre-cut pieces of food. It belonged to the world of ladies in their perfumed chambers, not to the world of men in their drafty halls. Its association with the Byzantine court only compounded this problem. Western Europeans often viewed their Eastern neighbors as effete, decadent, and untrustworthy. The fork was seen as just one more piece of evidence of their unmanly ways. Adopting it wasn't just adopting a tool, it was adopting an entire culture that was viewed with disdain. The resistance was not just among the clergy and the hyper-masculine. It seems that most people simply found it silly, a solution to a problem that no one really had. There are accounts of hosts who, seeking to be modern and sophisticated, would provide forks for their guests, only to watch them ignore the utensils and eat with their hands anyway. Sometimes, the forks would even be pocketed as strange, valuable souvenirs. After the meal, like taking home a weirdly shaped party favor you have no idea how to use. For centuries, the fork remained little more than a novelty item, a rare curiosity rather than a standard piece of cutlery. It existed, but it did not belong. It remains a point of contention among historians just how universal and doctrinally rigid this opposition truly was. Was every parish priest delivering fire and brimstone sermons against the evils of two-pronged tableware, or was this the loud opinion of a few influential, estraried, highly vocal churchmen like Peter Damian, whose writings simply had a better chance of surviving the centuries? It's likely that for the average person, the fork wasn't so much an object of sin as it was an object of complete irrelevance, a bizarre toy for the fantastically rich. The active hostility probably waxed and waned, but the general sense that the fork was unnatural, unchristian, and vaguely ridiculous lingered for a very, very long time. So, for hundreds of years, the fork was an outcast. It was demonized from the pulpit, mocked in the dining hall, and associated with everything foreign, vain, and unmanly. Its future looked bleak. How could such a vilified object ever hope to win a place at the table? It couldn't do it on the merits of simply moving food. To survive, it needed to become more than a tool. It needed a new identity. It needed to be rebranded from an instrument of sin into a symbol of something else, something powerful and aspirational. It had to stop being about decadence and start being about something the rising courts of Europe were becoming obsessed with: civilisation. And for centuries, our little fork had been an outcast, condemned as sacrilegious, effeminate, and absurd. It languished as a strange curiosity, a bauble for the fantastically rich and perhaps slightly odd. For the fork to truly find its place, it couldn't just be a tool for eating sticky fruit. It needed a new job. It needed to become a symbol, and it found its calling in the opulent, fiercely competitive courts of Renaissance Italy. As Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, a new wind was blowing from the south. The city-states of Florence, Venice, and Rome were rediscovering the art, philosophy, and learning of ancient Greece and Rome. They were obsessed with classical ideas of refinement, beauty, and order. In this context, the fork's Byzantine heritage, once a liability, was slowly transformed into an asset. It was no longer seen as merely foreign. It was seen as classical, a relic of the sophisticated Roman world they sought to emulate. Eating with a fork was a way to connect with this idealized, civilized past. The true turning point in the fork's fortunes, the moment it went from being an Italian eccentricity to an international trend, is famously pinned to one woman, Catherine de Medici, in Etienne Woolbite Saint-Saëns. This Italian noblewoman traveled to France to marry the future King Henry II. She brought with her a massive entourage, including her own chefs, and, according to the popular legend, a collection of delicate, silver dining forks. The French court at the time, for all its power, was still a relatively rustic place when it came to table manners. The nobility largely ate with their fingers and hunting knives. Catherine's refined, fork-driven dining style was a quiet but profound statement. Now, historians still argue whether Catherine de' Medici was the singular revolutionary that the story makes her out to be. The fork was likely already making slow, scattered inroads into France before her arrival. But whether she was the primary cause or simply a powerful catalyst, she became the enduring symbol of the fork's migration from Italy to France, which was the crucial step in its eventual conquest of Europe. What Catherine and the Italian nobility introduced was not just a utensil, but an entirely new philosophy of eating. The fork was no longer about practicality. It was about performance. It became a key tool in demonstrating one's civility, one's civilization and self-control. To use a fork skillfully was to show that you were above base, animalistic appetites. It created a physical and psychological distance between your body and your food, turning the messy, necessary act of eating into a graceful, highly controlled ballet. It was a way to publicly perform your membership in the elite, separating your refined person from the common folk who still ate with their hands. Mastering the fork was mastering yourself. This new purpose spurred an important evolution in the fork's design. The old two-pronged models, so easily likened to the devil's pitchfork, were a bit too good at spearing, but rather poor at anything else. In Italy, innovators began to add a third and then a fourth tine. Crucially, they also began to curve the tines upwards. This was a stroke of genius. The curved 14 fork was infinitely more versatile. It could still spear a piece of meat, but now it could also function like a miniature shovel, capable of securely scooping up peas, rice, or saucy mixtures that the two-pronged models would have struggled with. This new design made the fork less of a weapon and more of a proper utensil, greatly lowering the barrier to its adoption. It was, if you will, a user experience upgrade, as the French court, particularly under the fantastically theatrical reign of Louis XIV, embraced this new, hyper-refined dining etiquette. France became the undisputed arbiter of European taste. What happened at the Palace of Versailles was watched and meticulously copied by every ambitious monarch and aristocrat from Spain to Prussia. If the French king and his courtiers used forks, then you had to use a fork, lest you appear provincial and boorish. The fork became an instrument in the soft power battles of nations. A well-set table, complete with matching forks, knives, and spoons, the couvert, was a sign of a modern, powerful, and civilized. This led to some wonderfully fussy new rules. One curious tidbit of etiquette that emerged was the idea that a fork must never be held with the tines pointing up in a scooping motion when held in the left hand to eat off a knife. That was seen as a crude, shovel-like gesture. Instead, the back of the fork had to be used to balance the food. To this day, the continental style of dining reflects this elegant, if slightly impractical, maneuver. Using a fork correctly became a matter of intense social scrutiny, a way to easily spot an imposter. Imagine the anxiety of a minor country noble at his first dinner at court, faced with an array of forks and the terrifying possibility of using the fish fork for the dessert pastry. It was the original high-stakes version of not knowing which bread plate is yours, and the English, in their traditional spirit of rivalry with the French, were among the last to surrender. They viewed the French obsession with forks with deep suspicion, mocking it as pretentious and foppish. An English traveller in the early 17th century famously called the Italians' use of forks an affectation and was ridiculed at home for daring to use one himself. For a long time, an Englishman's refusal to use a fork was a patriotic statement, a small declaration of his rugged, no-nonsense national character. But the tide was unstoppable. By the end of the 17th century, the fork had won the battle for the top of society. It was firmly established as a necessary tool for anyone who considered themselves sophisticated or noble. It had been transformed from an instrument of the devil into a scepter of the elite. Yet, its journey was only half complete. For all its status, it remained a creature of the palace and the manor house. Its final migration into the homes of ordinary people would require one more revolution. Wove, our fork has had quite a journey. It survived accusations of being an instrument of the devil, outlasted the mockery of tough-skinned nobles, and successfully rebranded itself from a foreign oddity into a non-negotiable symbol of power and class. By the beginning of the 17th century, it sat proudly on the tables of every palace, manor house, and wealthy merchant's home in Europe. But its story was still incomplete. It was an aristocrat, but it was not yet a citizen. Its final transformation, from a symbol of elite status to an everyday object in nearly every kitchen drawer, required two final, powerful forces: the thunder of industry and the terror of the invisible. First came the factories. For most of its history, the fork was a precious object, painstakingly crafted by hand from expensive materials like silver, gold or intricately worked steel. This alone kept it out of the hands of the common person. But the Industrial Revolution, which had already changed the way we weave cloth and forge iron, now turned its attention to the dining table. New technologies and manufacturing processes, born in the clamorous workshops of England and Germany, made it possible to produce cutlery on a massive scale. New methods of silver plating, which allowed a thin, gleaming layer of precious metal to be fused onto a sturdy base of cheaper nickel or brass, were a game changer. Suddenly, a set of forks that looked and felt just like the ones in a nobleman's dining room could be had for a fraction of the cost. The burgeoning middle class, with their new disposable income and intense social aspirations, which were ravenous for these affordable symbols of good taste. Just as with fashion, owning the right kind of fork became a crucial way to display one's newly acquired status. A family might not be able to afford a grand estate, but they could certainly afford a set of 6 silver-plated fish forks. This created a consumer demand that factories were more than happy to meet, churning out forks by the tens of thousands. The fork, once a rare bird, was now migrating into the towns and cities, nesting in the sideboards of shopkeepers, clerks, and factory managers. But manufacturing alone would not have put a fork in every hand. The final push came from an entirely new obsession that gripped the Western world in the latter half of the 19th century. Hygiene, the groundbreaking work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, introduced the world to the terrifying concept of germs, tiny, invisible organisms that could cause sickness and death. This germ theory revolutionized medicine, but it also revolutionized daily life. Suddenly, the old ways were not just rustic, they were potentially lethal. Think back to that medieval banquet, with its shared bowls and use of hands. In the new light of germ theory, this communal, hands-on style of eating looked less like a quaint tradition and more like a terrifyingly efficient way to spread cholera. Sharing food, using unwashed fingers, these were no longer breaches of etiquette, but breaches of public safety. The fork was instantly promoted from a marker of social class to a vital tool in the war against disease. It was a small, personal barrier against the invisible enemies lurking on every surface. Doctors and public health advocates began to champion its use. It was no longer about seeming civilized, it was about being civilized in a new, scientific way. This fusion of status anxiety and health concerns led to one of the most wonderfully bizarre chapters in the fork's history, the Victorian era's explosive proliferation of highly specialized forks. Now that everyone in the respectable classes had basic forks, the truly elite needed a new way to distinguish themselves. They did this by inventing a fork for every conceivable foodstuff. The standard dinner fork was now joined by a bewildering army of comrades. There was the oyster fork, a tiny, 3-pronged trident for coaxing mollusks from their shells. There was the salad fork, slightly smaller than its dinner cousin. There were delicate, long-tined forks for eating berries, broad-tined forks for fish, and even specialized forks for eating terrapins or scooping up ice cream. Owning and knowing how to correctly use a sardine fork became a new, excruciatingly specific test of one's social standing. It was an arms race of etiquette, producing silverware drawers cluttered with objects whose purpose is now a complete mystery to most of us. The question of how precisely the fork finally conquered the dinner table remains a soft point of scholarly debate. Was its ultimate triumph a top-down phenomenon driven primarily by the social desire of the middle classes to imitate the aristocracy? Or was it a bottom-up revolution pushed forward by the new scientific understanding of hygiene that made forks seem like a rational, necessary choice for everyone? In truth, both forces were likely essential. The dream of seeming sophisticated pulled the fork into the homes of the aspiring, while the fear of germs pushed it onto the tables of the practical. And so, by the dawn of the 20th century, the fork had finally arrived. The long battle was over. The object once reviled as an immoral, unholy, and unmanly affectation was now an utterly unremarkable part of daily life, a mundane necessity you can buy in a pack of 6 from a department store. Its victory was so total that we have forgotten there was ever a war. The countless specialized Victorian forks have retreated, leaving behind the core trio we know today: the large dinner fork, the smaller salad or dessert fork, and perhaps the tiny oyster fork, living out its semi-retirement in seafood restaurants. The next time you sit down to eat, take a moment to look at the fork in your hand. This simple, elegant tool has seen it all. It has been a scandal in Venice, an enemy of the church, a scepter for kings and queens at Versailles, and a soldier in the war on germs. It is a testament to the fact that even the smallest, most ordinary objects carry extraordinary stories within them. Stories of culture, class, faith, and the endless, winding path of what it means to be civilized. The secret treaty behind your morning coffee, hewn long before the coffee shop on the corner, before the sleek espresso machine, before any of it. There was a mountain, a high green plateau in the ancient kingdom of Kaffa, in what we now know as Ethiopia. Here the air is thin and cool. The earth is a rich dark red, and lush, unfamiliar plants grow wild under the dappled sunlight. And it is here, according to a story that has been whispered for over 1,000 years, that our journey begins with a goat herder named Kaldi. The story, as it's told, is a simple one. Kaldi was tending his flock one afternoon when he noticed something peculiar. His goats, normally quite placid creatures, were behaving very strangely. They were leaping, dancing, and bleating with an enthusiasm that was, even for a goat, a little bit over the top. It was less a gentle grazing and more of an impromptu, chaotic rave party on the side of the mountain. Puzzled, Kaldi watched them and noticed they were all nibbling bright red berries from a small, glossy-leafed shrub he had never paid much mind to before. Curiosity, as it does, got the better of him. He picked a few of the mysterious berries and tried one himself, and then he understood. A wave of exhilarating energy surged through him. His fatigue vanished, his mind sharpened, and he felt as though he could dance with his goats all night long. Overjoyed by his discovery, Kaldi gathered a pocketful of the berries and ran to the nearest monastery to share his discovery with the head monk. The monk, however, was not impressed. He declared the berries to be the devil's work, a sinful temptation, and with a flourish of pious disapproval, he threw them into the fire. But then, a new kind of magic began to happen. As the berries, or rather, the beans inside them, began to roast in the flames, they released an aroma, a rich, captivating, intoxicating scent that none of the monks had ever experienced before. It was so heavenly that they rescued the roasted beans from the embers, crushed them, and, in an attempt to preserve them, placed them in a ewer of hot water. The result was a dark, fragrant, invigorating liquid. That night, the monks found that sipping this new brew allowed them to stay effortlessly awake and alert through their long hours of nocturnal prayer. It was not the devil's work, they decided, but a gift from God. Whether a goat herder named Kaldi ever truly existed is a matter of gentle debate among historians. His story doesn't appear in writing until the 16th century, a good 1,000 years after the fact, so it's likely more of a beautiful, convenient myth than a verifiable event. But like all good myths, it holds a deeper truth. It points us to the birthplace of coffee, the Ethiopian highlands, where the Coffea arabica plant grew wild, and it perfectly captures the moment of human discovery. The realization that this humble berry possessed a strange and wonderful power. From Ethiopia, the knowledge of coffee and the plant itself made the short but crucial journey across the Red Sea into the hands of the Sufi mystics of Yemen. It was here, particularly around the bustling port city of Mocha, that coffee's identity began to truly take shape. The Ethiopians may have discovered the bean, but it was the Arabs who perfected it. They took coffee from a raw berry to a cultivated crop, and from a curiosity to a culture. The Sufis embraced the new drink with devotional fervor. They called it kawa, an old Arabic word that once referred to wine. For them, this wine of Araby was a sacred tool. They would brew the roasted beans and drink the dark liquid during long nights of chanting and meditation, known as dhikr. The beverage allowed them to reach states of focused, ecstatic wakefulness, heightening their spiritual experience. Coffee wasn't for fun, it was for God. Its stimulant properties were not a recreational buzz, but a pathway to the divine. This holy purpose gave coffee a certain prestige, an aura of mystery and spiritual power. Soon, this sacred brew trickled out of the monasteries and into the cities. The world's first coffee houses, or caves, sprang up in Mecca, Cairo, and, of course, Mocha. These were nothing like the taverns of Europe. They weren't dark, roady places for drinking alcohol. Instead, they were schools of the wise, calm, contemplative spaces where men could gather to engage in conversation, listen to poetry, play chess, and, most importantly, exchange news and ideas, all over a cup of hot black coffee. This seems to be an enduring legacy, even today, suggesting a coffee meeting feels significantly more productive than suggesting you meet at a bar. As coffee's popularity soared, the rulers and merchants of Yemen realized they were sitting on a liquid gold mine. They had something the rest of the world wanted, and they took meticulous, almost paranoid, steps to protect their monopoly. A secret unwritten treaty was enforced with absolute strictness. No fertile coffee seed was ever to leave the country. Any coffee beans destined for export out of the port of Mocha had to be either boiled or parched first. This heat treatment killed the seed's embryo, ensuring that it could be roasted and brewed, but never, ever planted. This was a brilliant act of agricultural secrecy. It meant that nations could buy the product, but they could not buy the means of production. For decades, this Yemeni monopoly held firm, turning the port of Mocha into one of the wealthiest and most important trading hubs in the world. The world could have its coffee, but it would have it on Yemen's terms. The great, secret garden of coffee was kept under lock and key, but as the alluring aroma drifted across the globe, it was only a matter of time before someone decided they were tired of paying for the drink and decided to try and steal the tree itself. The secret was out, but the plant was still under lock and key. As the 20th century progressed, the aroma of coffee drifted out of the coffee houses of Cairo and Constantinople and found its way to Europe. In the damp, foggy streets of London, in the intellectual salons of Paris, and in the bustling ports of Amsterdam, a new kind of establishment was taking hold. The coffee house became the nerve center of the European city. Here, merchants made deals, scientists debated new discoveries, and political pamphlets were passed from hand to hand. These were the new penny universities, where for the price of a single cup of hot, black coffee, a man could be plugged into the entire world of news and ideas. And Europe became addicted very quickly. This new demand created an enormous business opportunity and a colossal frustration. All of this rich, dark, liquid gold was flowing from a single source, the closely guarded port of Mocha in Yemen. The powerful trading companies of Europe, especially the mighty Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Their entire business model was based on controlling production from end to end, owning the spice islands, the silk routes, the sources of their wealth. Yet with coffee, they were reduced to mere customers, paying premium prices to the Arab merchants, who held the global monopoly. This simply would not do. The desire to break that monopoly, to steal the plant and grow it themselves, became a corporate obsession. The first crack in this carefully constructed wall came not from a European spy, but from a holy man. The story, a beloved foundation of India's coffee industry, tells of a Sufi saint named Baba Budan. Sometime in the 14th century, he was on a pilgrimage, a Hajj, to the holy city of Mecca. While traveling through Yemen, he experienced coffee and, like so many others, was captivated by it. But he saw it as more than just a delightful beverage. He saw it as a gift to be shared with his own people back in the mountains of southern India. He knew of the strict export laws, the boiling of the beans that rendered them infertile. So, according to the legend, he took a great risk, acquired 7 raw, untreated coffee beans, 7 being a sacred number in Islam, and smuggled them out of the country by strapping them to his chest, hidden beneath his robes. The holiness of his person, it was said, allowed him to pass through the port of Mocha without being subjected to the usual rigorous searches. It's a wonderful image, the sacred and the profane conspiring, using a religious pilgrimage as the perfect cover for an act of industrial espionage. The historical accuracy of Baba Budan's 7-bean heist remains a matter of charming debate. It may be one of those stories that is too good not to be true. Regardless, those beans, or ones like them, did eventually make their way to the hills of Chikmagalur in India, where they were planted and gave rise to India's own coffee industry, far from the prying eyes of the European powers. The monopoly had been breached, but quietly. For a regional market, the grand global shattering of the Yemeni secret required a different kind of thief, not a saint, but a corporation. Enter the Dutch, methodical, patient, and ruthless. The Dutch East India Company had been probing the defenses of Mocha for years. They didn't rely on a single dashing spy. Their approach was more like a slow, meticulous siege. And sometime in the late 14th century, their persistence paid off. Accounts differ on the exact details. History is rarely a tidy narrative, but the most common story credits a Dutch merchant or official, perhaps named Peter van der Broeke, with finally succeeding where so many others had failed. Through some combination of bribery, clever deception, or simply taking advantage of a moment of lax security, he managed to acquire not just fertile beans, but several live coffee seedlings, the entire living plant. This was the jackpot. The secret was no longer just a recipe, but a living organism they could replicate infinitely. But the Dutch, ever the careful planners, did not rush their prize straight to the tropics. In one of the stranger twists of our story, these precious, heat-loving seedlings were carefully transported all the way back to the chilly, damp climate of the Netherlands. There, in the renowned botanical gardens of Amsterdam, under the protective glass of a greenhouse, Europe's first coffee tree was nurtured. Imagine that for a moment, the key to a future tropical empire, a plant destined to change economies across the globe, sitting quietly in a heated room, being fussed over by Dutch botanists, its nearest relative thousands of miles away. From this single coddled mother plant in Amsterdam, cuttings were taken and seedlings were propagated. The Dutch were building their arsenal. Their first attempt at creating a colonial coffee industry was in their colony of Malabar, in India. It failed, but their next attempt, on the lush volcanic island of Java, in what is now Indonesia, was a spectacular success. The humid climate and rich soil were perfect. The seedlings took root. They grew into shrubs. They produced their own red berries, and by the early 18th century, the first shipment of Javanese coffee sailed into the port of Amsterdam. This was a moment of profound triumph for the VOC. They had done it. They had broken the monopoly of Mocha. As the world's supply of coffee was no longer tethered to a single port in Arabia, they were now the masters of their own supply, grown in their own colony, picked by labor under their control. The price of coffee on the European market began to fall, and its availability soared. The coffeehouse culture exploded, but as the merchants in Amsterdam celebrated their victory, and the citizens of Europe enjoyed their cheaper, more plentiful brew, a dark shadow was lengthening over the island of Java. The little seedling, smuggled out of Yemen under a cloak of secrecy, had finally found fertile ground, and from that ground would spring not just coffee, but a brutal new system of exploitation that would forever change the meaning of a simple cup of coffee. Okay? The coffee seedling, stolen and smuggled out of its ancestral lands, had found a new and profitable home in Java. For the Dutch merchants in Amsterdam, this was the culmination of a long-held dream. They had broken the Arabian monopoly. They had, in the parlance of our modern world, successfully disrupted the market. But for the people of Java, this triumph was the beginning of a long nightmare. The arrival of the coffee shrub did not bring prosperity. It brought chains. Initially, the Dutch encouraged local rulers to grow coffee, paying them for the product. But as the demand from Europe swelled into a roar, this casual arrangement was no longer enough. The Dutch needed more coffee, and they needed it cheaper. In the Endbouwwetsers, they implemented a brutally efficient system known officially as the cultuurstelsel, or the cultivation system. Its logic was simple and pitiless. The colonial government designated a portion of every Javanese village's farmland to be used for growing government-owned export crops, primarily coffee, but also sugar and indigo. In place of paying taxes in money, farmers were forced to provide their land and their labor. They had to spend a significant part of their year planting, tending, and harvesting a crop they would never taste, on land that once grew the rice that fed their families. The human cost was catastrophic. Fertile rice paddies, which had sustained communities for centuries, were converted into coffee plantations. A bad coffee harvest could mean a village fell into debt and deeper servitude. Even a good harvest offered no relief, as the prices were fixed by the colonial power. But worst of all, when famines struck, as they did with horrifying regularity, the system's cruelty became undeniable. Villagers starved while surrounded by hillsides lush with coffee plants, a cash crop they could not eat, destined for cups on the other side of the world. It was a system that turned an entire island into a corporate plantation, and transforming a symbol of sophisticated leisure into a machine for generating misery. The true impact of the cultivation system on the local economy remains a subject of intense historical scrutiny, but there is no debating the immense wealth it funneled into the coffers of the Netherlands, a fortune built on forced labor and empty stomachs. Meanwhile, the other European powers watched the Dutch success with envious eyes. Coffee was big business, and France wanted in through their own means. Likely yet another, less famously documented act of corporate espionage, the French acquired a seedling from the Dutch and began cultivating it on their own Caribbean island of Martinique. Now, two European empires had the power to grow coffee, and in a fitting turn of events, the Dutch would have their own secrets stolen from them. Rochefort, this time with a flair for the romantic drama that the French seemed to enjoy. Enter Francisco de Melo Palheta, a handsome and ambitious official from the Portuguese colony of Brazil. In the Eaton-Tibite arses, Brazil was not a coffee power, but the Portuguese crown saw the fortunes being made and wanted a piece of the action. Palheta was sent to neighboring French Guiana, officially to mediate a nagging border dispute, but his real mission was to acquire the coffee plant. The French, understandably, were guarding their new asset just as jealously as the Arabs and the Dutch had before them. Palheta could find no way to buy or steal a seedling, so he deployed a different tactic. He focused his considerable charms on the wife of the French governor. The details of their relationship are lost to history. A footnote whispered in the margins of empire, but what we know is that at his official farewell banquet, as Palheta was preparing to leave French Guiana, the governor's wife presented him with a parting gift, a large bouquet of flowers. It was a seemingly innocent, public gesture of goodwill, but hidden deep inside the bouquet, nestled amongst the vibrant blossoms, were several live coffee cuttings, the seeds of a new empire, a strange romantic token to be sure, but one that would change the course of history. Palheta returned to Brazil a hero. The cuttings were planted in the region of Pará and found a climate that was the rockst If anything, even more perfect for coffee than Java had been. Brazil was vast. It had the ideal soil, the ideal altitude, the ideal rainfall. Coffee exploded across the landscape. By the early 14th century, Brazil was on its way to becoming the undisputed king of coffee, producing more than the rest of the world combined. But this new kingdom of black gold, like Java's, was built on a foundation of profound human suffering. The sheer scale of Brazil's coffee plantations required a massive, disposable workforce, and this demand was met by the horrific engine of the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved Africans were forced onto ships, transported across the ocean in unspeakable conditions, and sold to plantation owners. Their lives were consumed by the back-breaking, sun-up-to-sundown labor of clearing forests, planting seedlings, and harvesting the red coffee cherries by hand. The coffee boom in Brazil did not just sustain slavery, it dramatically creating an insatiable demand for human bodies long after other nations had begun to abolish the trade. This flood of slave-produced coffee from Brazil had a predictable effect. The global price of coffee crashed. It was no longer a luxury beverage for elites in Parisian salons. It became cheap. It became the drink of the masses. It was the hot, bitter fuel for the new working class of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America. A factory worker in Manchester, facing a grueling 16-hour shift, could now afford the jolt of caffeine needed to stay awake at the Loom. And so, a dark global circuit was completed. The exhausting labor of one person in a factory was fueled by the forced, unpaid labor of another on a plantation thousands of miles away. The affordable price that made coffee a daily ritual for millions was a direct subsidy paid in human lives. The chains of Java and the horrors of the Brazilian slave plantations were the invisible ingredients in every cheap cup. Enter the Dutch. Methodical, patient, and ruthless, the Dutch East India Company had been probing the defenses of Mocha for years. They didn't rely on a single dashing spy. Their approach was more like a slow, meticulous siege. And sometime in the late 13th century, their persistence paid off. Accounts differ on the exact details. History is rarely a tidy narrative, but the most common story credits a Dutch merchant or official, perhaps named Peter van der Broeke, with finally succeeding where so many others had failed. Through some combination of bribery, clever deception, or simply taking advantage of a moment of lax security, he managed to acquire not just fertile beans, but several live coffee seedlings. The entire living plant. This was the jackpot. The secret was no longer just a recipe, but a living organism. They could replicate infinitely, but the Dutch, ever the careful planners, did not rush their prize straight to the tropics. In one of the stranger twists of our story, these precious, heat-loving seedlings were carefully transported all the way back to the chilly, damp climate of the Netherlands. There, in the renowned botanical gardens of Amsterdam, under the protective glass of a greenhouse, Europe's first coffee tree was nurtured. Imagine that for a moment, the key to a future tropical empire, a plant destined to change economies across the globe, sitting quietly in a heated room, being fussed over by Dutch botanists, its nearest relative thousands of miles away. And so, the world was conquered by coffee. The humble plant, once a closely guarded secret on an Ethiopian plateau, had been carried across the globe by saints and spies, by Dutch corporations and the mistresses of French governors. Its cultivation, built first on the forced labor of the Javanese and then on the industrial-scale slavery of Brazil, had succeeded in making coffee cheap, plentiful, and ubiquitous. The potent dark liquid became the fuel of the modern world, the great soberer upper, the trusted companion of the early riser and the late-night thinker. The battle, it seemed, was over. But systems, like ghosts, don't simply vanish when the buildings they haunt are torn down. Slavery was eventually abolished. The great colonial empires crumbled, and nations from Indonesia to Brazil fought for and won their independence. The overt, violent structures of the past were dismantled, and yet, if you look closely at the steam rising from your cup this morning, you might see the faint outline of the economic architecture that those empires left behind. The secret treaty was not torn up. It was rewritten in the invisible ink of global trade. Today, we live with what economists call the coffee paradox. Coffee is one of the most valuable traded commodities in the world. As a finished product, the lattes, the espressos, the bags of roasted beans sold in supermarkets, it represents a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And yet, the farmers who actually grow the coffee beans, the vast majority of whom are smallholders in the very tropical regions where this global commerce originated, often face considerable. This creates a difficult question. How can a product be so valuable to the world while the people who create it often see a very small return for their labor? The answer lies in the economic structure that was established in that era. The early global trade in coffee was organized for a specific purpose: to source the raw, unprocessed beans from the agricultural regions where they grew. This allowed the more financially rewarding work to be done elsewhere. The primary profits were not found in the initial farming, but in the later stages of the process: the roasting, blending, packaging, shipping, and the final sale to consumers. The growing regions provided the agricultural labor, while European centers of commerce typically managed the processing, technology, market access, and financial aspects of the trade. This business model meant that the source of the product and the source of the main profits were in two different parts of the world. Many historians and economists observe that this economic model has proven to be very durable. While the specific participants have changed over time, the fundamental structure remains recognizable. Today, the countries where coffee is grown still tend to export the raw, unroasted beans. These are typically handled as an agricultural commodity, meaning their market value can fluctuate significantly. Meanwhile, the later stages of production, such as roasting, marketing, and managing large cafe chains, are often concentrated in the coffee importing parts of the world. As a result, the historic blueprint that separates where a product is grown from, where most of its final economic value is added, continues to influence the global coffee trade. Now, there is ongoing discussion among scholars regarding the current economic disparities in the industry. They debate whether these are primarily rooted in those early global trade systems, or if they have been more significantly shaped by modern economic factors, such as international financial structures and the uncertainties of the global marketplace. It's a complex picture, certainly not a simple, straight line. But the similarities are noticeable. The geographical distribution of economic challenges and financial success in the coffee industry today still often aligns with these historical patterns of trade. The widespread view of coffee as a standardized product gave rise to a fascinating cultural reaction in the late Earth and early Arsine centuries. This is the movement often called third wave coffee. It's the trend that gave us the meticulous barista who can tell you the name of the farmer who grew your beans, the altitude they were grown at, and the precise flavor notes you should be detecting. In many ways, this movement is an attempt to counteract the effects of treating coffee as an anonymous bulk product. It seeks to restore individual identity to the beans, treating coffee not as a uniform, interchangeable good, but more like a fine wine, with a unique origin, a specific story, and a connection to the place where it was grown. It's a thoughtful effort to reintroduce the idea that coffee from one particular hillside should be appreciated for its unique qualities. Grown elsewhere, this movement aims to create a stronger and more appreciative link between the final cup and the specific farm where its story began. So, what does this long, tangled history mean for the cup in your hands? It means that when you buy a coffee from a global chain, only a tiny fraction of what you pay, often just a few pennies, will ever make its way back to the farmer who started the entire process. The vast majority is absorbed by labor in the cafe, marketing, logistics, rent, and corporate profit. And it's why movements for fair trade, direct trade, and other ethical sourcing models have become so important. They are all, in their own way, attempts to renegotiate that centuries-old secret treaty. They are attempts to ensure that more of the final price of the product flows back to its origin, to create a system where value is not separated from labor. Our story, which began with dancing goats on a forgotten hillside, ends here. With you, that simple daily choice of where and what to drink makes you a quiet participant in this long, ongoing history, not as a matter of guilt, but as a matter of connection. Your morning coffee is a vessel that contains the entire, complicated story of the modern world, a story of ritual and religion, of espionage and empire, of exploitation, and our enduring quest for a more just and equitable way of living. It's a lot to find in one small cup. Thank you for allowing me to share this story with you. I hope it brings a new layer of richness to a ritual you already enjoy. May your mind be calm and your rest be serene. Until our next journey together, you...